Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where today's AI hype gets sorted from the actual moving pieces. A lot of this week's AI debate comes down to one question. Are we watching a normal software cycle or the early stages of something much more destabilizing? The interesting part is that even people who disagree on the big story often agree on the bottlenecks, the incentives, and the places things could go wrong. One of the sharper forecasts here is Daniel Kokotajlo putting roughly 50-50 odds on autonomous R&D level models by late 2028, with full coding automation maybe 1 to 2 years after that. That's a concrete claim, and it helps to separate the pieces. Coding automation means generating, testing, fixing, and shipping software with minimal human intervention. Research automation is broader. It means planning experiments, interpreting results, deciding what to try next, and coordinating a messy process over time. The evidence for fast coding progress is stronger than the evidence for near-term autonomous science. Agents already look decent on bounded engineering tasks, and a lot of companies think the remaining gap is reliability, context management, and tooling. The jump from that to research management is where confidence should drop. Sayash argues firms could close the remaining gaps fast and automate very high percentages of some research tasks, even up toward 99% in narrow settings. That might be true for standardized workflows, but it's still speculative when people generalize from task automation to full research autonomy. A recurring theme across these discussions is that data, especially curated expert data, may explain more of recent progress than people want to admit. That matters because it changes the story from secret genius architectures to a more industrial process of collecting, filtering, labeling, and distilling useful examples. If a narrow skill needs hundreds of expert demonstrations, then the frontier is not just bigger models, it's legal drafters, consultants, domain specialists, and giant pipelines that turn tacit knowledge into training distributions. That also explains why open-source systems can sometimes narrow the frontier gap quickly. If the lead is only a few months, public APIs and accessible outputs can leak a lot of the value. You don't need to steal magic weights if the real advantage is partly embedded in data you can imitate. This connects to a harder point. Humans appear vastly more sample efficient than today's models. Frontier systems train on tens or hundreds of trillions of tokens. A human lifetime of text exposure is more like a couple 100 million tokens. That gap is not small. It's enormous, and scaling laws do not obviously rescue it. Chinchilla-style logic suggests bigger parameter counts can reduce data requirements somewhat, maybe by an order of magnitude, but not by the 1,000-fold to million-fold needed to match human learning efficiency. People sometimes answer that humans get much richer multimodal input than text models do. There's something to that, but it doesn't fully explain the gap. Blind and deaf people still retain general intelligence, which is a useful reminder that raw sensory volume alone is not the whole story. So the strongest supported claim here is not that models can't become very capable, it's that brute force scaling alone probably does not explain or solve human-like learning efficiency. Reinforcement learning gets pitched as a workaround because it can manufacture high-quality training examples. If you have a verifier or a rubric, you can spend compute searching for successful trajectories and then train on those. That's real, but it's not magic. RL still usually needs some foothold. The model or prior policy has to have a non-zero chance of stumbling toward a good answer, and many practical RL setups still lean on large amounts of expert data. There's another limitation people are running into in practice. Models can look amazing on day one and then underperform a decent human intern over a few weeks because they don't really accumulate durable learning between sessions. Most of the gains are in context, not persistent. Whether that can be patched with better scaffolds, memory systems, or periodic weight updates is still open. But if continual learning stays weak, that slows the story that agents will just keep compounding their own competence in the wild. On recursive self-improvement, there's less disagreement than it first appears. Most people accept that systems can improve other systems. The actual fight is over, whether that produces runaway superintelligence or just faster but still bounded capability gains. The more grounded risk arguments here are not sci-fi ones. Daniel focuses on concentration of power and loss of control if a few actors race ahead aggressively. Sayash puts more weight on military deployment and weaponization as the nearer-term danger. That second point deserves emphasis because it does not require godlike AI. Modest systems can still enable targeting, coordination, surveillance, and autonomous weapons. Diffusion could easily outrun any international consensus, especially if countries treat this as a standard strategic technology rather than an exceptional one. The robot story is a good example of capabilities colliding with geopolitics. Companies are selling unitary-based humanoids for household and industrial data collection, with prices that sound almost consumer-adjacent depending on sensors and dexterous hands. The commercial pitch is obvious: gather embodied data at scale, improve robot policies, and build an installed base. The security concern is also obvious. If the hardware and telemetry pathways are linked to China, lawmakers will treat that as a supply chain and surveillance issue, not just a robotics issue. If import bans expand, that doesn't just hit one vendor. It reshapes who gets to collect embodied data, which then feeds back into who leads in robotics. On the enterprise side, Satya Nadella's framing is actually pretty useful. Firms need a compounding learning loop where human judgment, relationships, and workflows combine with model outputs, infrastructure, and feedback. That's what he calls an AI learning system. The phrase token capital sounds abstract, but the practical point is simple. A company can buy model access and still get nothing if it lacks scaffolding, instrumentation, and clean feedback loops. Then all it has is employees pasting prompts into a box and producing hard-to-measure noise. That's why the applied AI layer matters: routing between expensive and cheap models, capturing context, tuning agents to specific workflows, and building interfaces people will actually use, maybe where a lot of durable value sits. The Accenture stumble is interesting in that light. Bookings drop, and market punishment do not prove AI demand is fake. They may show that selling transformation rhetoric is easier than operationalizing measurable returns at scale. The KPMG workplace data points in a practical direction. Top performers are not just better prompt engineers, they use AI as a reasoning partner. They frame the problem, iterate, critique outputs, and steer the interaction. That suggests a skill gap, but maybe a teachable one. The bigger policy wrinkle is that as the marketing premium of being visibly AI-first fades, firms may start hiding AI use or softening the language around AI-driven labor changes. That creates a transparency gap right when disclosure matters more. Policy debates are messy, but there is some convergence around external audits, transparency, model security standards, and restrictions on deceptive fine-tuning. The newer White House and Anthropic work on grading security flaws fits that pattern. It starts from a realistic premise that no model will be perfectly secure. More radical proposals, like taxing huge chunks of AI company equity into a giant public fund, are much more contentious. You can argue they address concentration, but critics are right that they verge on de facto nationalization. That's a very different policy category from audits and disclosure. The cleanest way to read this whole landscape is that the normal technology camp and the transformative AI camp are arguing mostly about degree, speed, and tail risk, not about whether the systems matter. AI can be economically valuable long before it becomes human-like in sample efficiency or fully autonomous in research. Training costs can still make sense when spread across millions or billions of uses. And labor effects may stay mixed for a while. Several people expect software engineering demand to rise into 2027 because AI handles more routine work while humans stay on architecture, judgment, integration, and oversight. The biotech optimism belongs in that bucket too. Claims that AI could compress drug discovery from years to months are exciting, but the strongest version of that story still depends on wet lab bottlenecks, regulation, and whether early wins generalize beyond selected cases. That's the picture for now. More data dependence, more agent tooling, and bigger fights over control than over raw intelligence alone. This is Podkey Slopcast. Thanks for listening. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.